April 10, 1834. The people of New Orleans gathered on Royal Street, their eyes fixed on the smoke spilling from the grand three-story mansion at 1140 Royal. Firelight painted the ornate balconies red, while panicked shouts echoed off the cobblestones. Neighbors rushed in, expecting to rescue valuables, maybe frightened servants. But what they found instead has haunted this city for nearly 2 centuries. When rescuers broke open a locked upstairs chamber, they claimed to have discovered enslaved men and women chained to the walls, their bodies broken, scarred, and contorted in ways too cruel to imagine. One witness told reporters it was more like a scene from hell than from a house. Another swore he heard faint moans through the smoke. That night, Madame Delphine LaLaurie, one of the most admired socialites in New Orleans, became something else entirely. To her neighbors, she wasn't the graceful hostess they had once envied. She was a monster. And yet, here's the contradiction. For every chilling eyewitness account, there are historians who warn us, not all of it may be true. Some say the stories of mutilation grew darker with each retelling. Others point to funeral records, which show deaths but not necessarily the grotesque tortures described in newspapers. So what really happened inside the LaLaurie Mansion that April night? Was it truly a chamber of horrors, or has folklore twisted fact into legend? Quick pause. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's always wild to see these sleepless stories circle the globe. Because tonight, we're not just exploring the fire. We're walking through the echo of screams, the gossip of society, the contradictions between history and myth. And as we go deeper, the line between fact and haunting will blur. The crowd on Royal Street demanded justice. They smashed the LaLaurie's fine furniture, they ripped paintings from the walls, and they tried to drag Delphine into the street. But by the next morning, she was gone. The woman once called the Queen of Creole Society had vanished into the smoke. And upstairs, in that ruined mansion, a locked door was finally forced open, revealing a sight so horrific that one rescuer quit his job on the spot. But before I tell you what they saw, I want to know, have you ever been so scared you walked away from something forever? Tell me below. To understand why the LaLaurie Mansion still chills us today, we have to step back into the New Orleans of the early 1800s. A city unlike any other in America. Imagine it. Gas lamps flickering over wrought iron balconies. Street musicians playing violins in courtyards fragrant with magnolia and smoke. Ballrooms where silk gowns swished across polished floors, while behind the scenes, whispers and scandals spread like fire. This was Creole New Orleans, a city caught between two worlds. By day, it was a bustling port of trade and elegance. By night, it was alive with secrets. In the shadows of high society parties, the system of slavery kept the city's wealth polished and bright. And beneath the chandeliers, many people wondered who was truly in control. The Haitian Revolution, just decades earlier, had struck terror into the hearts of the wealthy. Stories of rebellion, of enslaved people rising against masters, lingered in the Creole imagination. In New Orleans, those fears simmered quietly, never far from the surface. It was into this world that Delphine LaLaurie stepped. Born into affluence, married 3 times, and finally settled in her grand Royal Street mansion, she embodied the grace of society's elite. She hosted glittering gatherings where musicians played, politicians mingled, and the city's most powerful smiled beneath their jeweled masks. But masks can hide rot. And behind the curtains of refinement, darker rumors began to drift. Servants whispered of cruelty. Neighbors noticed strange silences in the courtyard, doors locked tight when they should have been open. Some say screams were heard late at night, muffled by thick plaster walls. Still, no one confronted her, not openly. Because in New Orleans, reputation was everything. And the LaLauries were untouchable. Or so it seemed. This was a city where appearances meant survival. Where behind every elegant parlor might lurk a secret. And in the spring of 1834, those secrets would spill into the streets, smoke rising, doors breaking, and the carefully painted mask of Madame LaLaurie burning away. Long before the fire tore open the LaLaurie Mansion, the whispers had already begun. Neighbors in the French Quarter noticed things they couldn't quite explain. Servants who seemed to vanish without farewell. Locked doors in a home meant for entertaining. And a silence that clung to the house, even during parties, as though part of it had been sealed away from music and laughter. One story spread after a young enslaved girl supposedly fell, or leapt, from the roof of the mansion, trying to escape Madame LaLaurie's punishment. Some claimed she had been brushing her mistress's hair when she tugged too hard and Delphine's rage turned violent. Whether fact or rumor, the tale of the girl's death settled like a ghost in the neighborhood, and the household's reputation grew darker. Then there were the stories told by Harriet Martineau, an English writer who visited New Orleans. She later published accounts of cruelty, claiming the LaLauries treated their enslaved people with unusual severity. According to Martineau, the rumors were whispered behind lace fans at society gatherings, but few dared speak them aloud in public. After all, Delphine was still a fixture in high society, her salons full of music, her manners impeccable. But behind those polished doors, something felt wrong. A judge once visited the home after reports of mistreatment reached the authorities. Officially, Delphine was ordered to release some of her servants. Yet the judge's words were quickly forgotten, and soon the house was as full as before, its windows shuttered, its secrets intact. It's easy to imagine the scene on Royal Street in those years, a mansion glowing with candlelight, laughter drifting out into the night, and yet, in the quiet hours, neighbors swore they heard faint cries carried on the wind. The whispers kept growing, but no one truly acted. Not until the flames forced the city to look. And when the doors were finally broken down in 1834, those whispers became screams etched into history. The mansion at 1140 Royal Street was a jewel in the French Quarter. 3 stories tall, with graceful wrought iron balconies curling like lace over the street below. White shutters framed tall windows, and the front door opened into a grand hall meant to impress. To passing eyes, it was elegance itself. Inside, the rooms were expansive, with high ceilings and polished wood floors. Chandeliers cast soft, golden light over glittering soirees. Music drifted from string quartets, mingling with the murmur of New Orleans' most powerful families. To be invited here was to step into the heart of Creole society. At the center of it all stood Madame Delphine LaLaurie. Always poised, always refined. Her gowns were the latest from Paris, her manner gracious, her parties envied. Guests saw a woman of wealth and culture, surrounded by beauty and civility. But those same walls held others, people who weren't guests, but possessions. Enslaved men, women, and children who moved silently through the corridors, carrying trays, pouring wine, sweeping ashes from the hearth. Their presence was expected but invisible, their labor the unseen engine of the household. There were other figures, too. Dr. Louis LaLaurie, Delphine's much younger husband, whose medical practice added prestige but also gossip. Whispers of a strained marriage, of quarrels echoing behind closed doors. Delphine's daughters from earlier marriages, said to be gentle, perhaps even sympathetic to the servants, though powerless to change the house's rhythm. And then, the rooms most guests never entered. The narrow staircases leading to cramped quarters above the carriage house. Doors that stayed locked. Windows kept shuttered, even in the humid summer air. These were the spaces that gave the mansion its unease, the silent voids where rumor took root. Neighbors would later recall that for all its beauty, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. As though the house itself knew it was keeping secrets. This house was not just a stage for parties. It was a cage. And the longer the LaLauries lived there, the stronger the whispers became. But how do whispers become hauntings? In New Orleans, where history and superstition mingle like smoke and song, all it takes is a single spark. The night of the fire should have ended the story. A grand house destroyed, its mistress disgraced, her secrets laid bare. But in New Orleans, nothing ever ends so cleanly. Almost as soon as the smoke cleared, the mansion began to take on a second life. Neighbors swore the house never truly went quiet again. They spoke of cries echoing through the empty rooms, as though the walls themselves had soaked in the pain. Some said the scent of burning flesh lingered in the halls long after the flames were gone. Others claimed that when they passed the house at night, They could hear chains dragging across the floor, or low voices murmuring from behind bricked-up windows. By day, children dared each other to touch the mansion's gates. By night, grown men crossed the street to avoid it. Within weeks of the fire, rumors spread of shadowy figures seen pacing behind the shattered shutters. A woman in black was said to glide silently across the balcony, her face pale, her hands clasped. Was it Madame LaLaurie herself, returned to watch over her ruined home? Or was it one of the souls trapped within, restless and unwilling to leave? The mansion's reputation only deepened as decades passed. Tenants who lived there after the LaLauries fled told of groans in the floorboards, of sudden icy drafts in the parlor, of doors slamming with no wind to move them. Some claimed to see spectral figures chained in the upstairs rooms, their forms flickering like candle smoke. And each generation added its own layer to the legend, until the mansion became more than a place. It became a wound the city could never quite close. So many tales, so many witnesses, yet never the same story twice. That's how hauntings take root, not in proof, but in echoes. And here's where I pause to ask you, if you had to walk past the LaLaurie Mansion at midnight, would you look up at the windows, or keep your eyes on the ground? Tell me in the comments. I need to know how brave you really are. It was the morning of April 10, 1834, when flames first licked the kitchen walls of the LaLaurie Mansion. Neighbors rushed to help, forming bucket lines, shouting above the roar. But as smoke filled the grand halls, rescuers stumbled upon something far worse than fire. In the kitchen, they found an elderly woman chained by her ankle to the stove. She was the cook, they said, starved, beaten, and half mad from the heat. Through cracked lips, she confessed that she had started the blaze herself. She would rather burn the house down, she whispered, than endure another day of torment. Her words chilled the rescuers more than the fire ever could. Driven by her warning, they forced their way upstairs. The air grew hotter, thicker, filled with the scent of burning wood and something sharper, something metallic, like blood and rust. Then they reached a locked door. Behind it came faint cries, weak but unmistakable. They smashed it open. What they saw inside has been retold for nearly 2 centuries. Enslaved men and women, chained to walls and beds. Bodies scarred, bones twisted, mouths gagged to stifle their screams. Some were said to have iron collars pinning their heads in place, others with deep wounds still raw. One account claimed a man was strapped to a wooden board, unable to move, his body broken. Another swore they saw a woman with her limbs pulled taut, as if stretched beyond nature. The rescuers fled into the street, gagging on smoke and horror. Word spread in an instant. By the time the fire was out, the mob outside had become a storm. They smashed windows, tore down doors, and ripped the house apart with bare hands. Madame LaLaurie herself? She slipped into a waiting carriage and disappeared into the chaos. By dawn, she was gone, vanished like a shadow into the morning mist. And upstairs, the ruined rooms remained. Empty now, but stained with memory. That night, the mansion stood silent, its walls blackened by smoke. But neighbors swore they still heard cries echoing from within. Not the cries of fire, but of something that refused to end. The morning after the fire, New Orleans awoke to chaos. The streets were littered with debris, the charred remnants of the LaLaurie Mansion smoldering beneath a sky thick with smoke. Neighbors whispered and speculated, trying to make sense of what they'd seen, or what they'd imagined in the fear-filled glow of the flames. Official investigators were called, but their work was fraught with complication. Police reports documented the damage, but many details were missing, conflicting, or deliberately vague. Some claimed the full horrors of the upstairs chambers were exaggerated in the press. Others insisted the accounts of mutilation were true, citing witnesses who had been there at the scene. The city's legal system attempted to respond. Authorities wanted to track down Delphine LaLaurie and hold her accountable. But she had vanished, slipping through the chaos like smoke herself. Arrest warrants were issued, but by the time they reached her, she was already far from the city, rumored to be in Paris. Her flight became part of the legend, a ghostly escape that mirrored the horror left behind in her home. Historians and preservationists have since pored over the conflicting accounts. The Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans notes that while deaths and abuse did occur, the most grotesque details may have been sensationalized by the press and later storytellers. Contemporary newspapers aimed to sell papers, and lurid tales of torture would capture every reader's attention. Yet there is no doubt that suffering took place. Slave registers, property inventories, and first-hand depositions confirm that people were mistreated and some perished in her household. The difference between legend and fact is subtle but important. The fire exposed cruelty, but over time, storytelling magnified it into a nightmarish myth. Even so, the city's reaction was immediate and visceral. A mob of angry citizens ransacked the house, breaking furniture, tearing down doors, and dragging away items in symbolic justice. That same anger would be passed down through history, entwined with whispers of curses and hauntings. Investigations could not fully reconcile the evidence with the stories. Skeptics pointed to missing documentation and inconsistent witness reports. Believers pointed to the testimonies of survivors and the lingering smell, sounds, and shadows that seemed to haunt the property for decades. So the mansion became a paradox, legally a crime scene, historically documented, and yet enveloped in mystery. The truth and the legend existed side by side, like two voices whispering through the walls. The fire was over, the flames long gone, but the voices remained. Not literal voices, but the echoes of those who had lived through the horror. Survivors, neighbors, and officials left records, some brief, some detailed, capturing what they had seen, what they had heard, and what they would never forget. One of the earliest depositions came from a neighbor who had rushed into the street that morning. He recalled the fire's roar, the smoke so thick it burned his eyes, and the sudden, horrifying glimpse of a chained figure in the upper rooms. "I thought it was a vision," he wrote later. "Something conjured by the smoke and fear. But the chains clinked as she fell, and the sound will haunt me to my grave." Another deposition, from a city official called to inspect the house after the mob's ransacking, described what he called a scene of unimaginable cruelty. He detailed the upstairs chambers, iron collars, bound limbs, and signs of long-term confinement. Yet he also admitted in his writing that some rooms had been emptied or destroyed, and that evidence could not be verified in every case. Even servants who survived gave chilling testimony. One recalled being forced to remain silent during the fire, watching neighbors tear through the house, not understanding what was happening or why the mistress had vanished. "We were invisible," the testimony read. "We were shadows in our own home, and then the fire made us ghosts in the eyes of the living." What makes these testimonies compelling is not just the horror, but the contradiction. Some accounts describe mutilation in precise, gruesome detail. Others speak only of confinement and fear. Historians have noted these discrepancies, highlighting how trauma, rumor, and the spectacle of a public fire may have influenced recollection. Even so, taken together, the testimonies paint a house of suffering. A home where fear lingered, where the ordinary sounds of daily life, footsteps, whispered orders, the clink of chains, became part of an invisible narrative no visitor could escape. And yet these voices, real, living witnesses, also carried uncertainty. Which parts of their memories belonged to fact, which to imagination, and which to the collective legend that New Orleans would never let die. Even decades after the fire, the LaLaurie Mansion seemed to remember. The walls, the floors, and the creaking staircases carried echoes of a past too dark to fully forget. Visitors, historians, and even the modern owners have described it, a chill in the air that doesn't belong to the humid New Orleans night, or a faint metallic scent that lingers long after you leave. Some artifacts survived, or at least traces of them. Archival property records show the layout of the upstairs chambers, narrow rooms, hidden alcoves, and locked closets where servants once disappeared. Funeral registers confirm deaths among the enslaved people owned by the LaLauries, though the precise numbers remain uncertain. Even today, preservationists note architectural oddities in the house: bricked-up windows, heavy doors with complex locks, and uneven floors that might once have concealed stairs or cages. These traces are subtle, almost imperceptible, but they whisper of the building's grim history. Objects themselves have stories. A local historian recounted seeing a rusted iron collar believed to have belonged to the mansion's enslaved occupants, now preserved in a private archive. Other traces are less tangible. A chill on the staircase, the way candlelight seems to flicker more violently in the old dining room, or the sudden creak of a floorboard in a room that shouldn't bear weight. Even the street outside bears memory. Residents over the years have reported seeing shadowy figures behind windows, hearing faint cries carried on the wind, or glimpsing a pale woman pacing the balcony long after the mansion's most infamous occupant vanished. These are not confirmed sightings. They are stories, whispers, but they persist, embedding the mansion into New Orleans folklore. The LaLaurie Mansion is not just a building. It is a vessel of memory, cruelty, and legend. The traces of its history survive in both tangible artifacts and the collective consciousness of a city unwilling to forget. The LaLaurie Mansion is more than bricks and mortar. It's a mirror of New Orleans' past, reflecting both elegance and horror, wealth and cruelty. Its story has seeped into the city's consciousness, shaping folklore, tourism, and even the way locals talk about the old French Quarter at night. Ghost tours pause at the wrought iron gates, guides recounting in hushed voices the chains, the screams, the shadows. The mansion has inspired television shows, movies, and novels. American Horror Story immortalized Delphine LaLaurie in popular culture, cementing her as both a historical figure and a spectral legend. Tourists snap photos, some reporting strange orbs in their pictures, cold drafts in hallways, or the sudden feeling of being watched. Psychologically, the mansion taps into the deep fear of hidden cruelty, the notion that behind polite facades, unimaginable horrors can hide. Scholars have noted that the legend endures not just because of the 1834 fire, but because the story resonates with cultural memory, the terror of unchecked power, the invisible suffering of the oppressed, and the haunting question of justice denied. Even modern owners and real estate visitors comment on unease inside the mansion. Some report footsteps, shadows, or the eerie sensation of being followed. While skeptics point to the power of suggestion, these experiences continue to feed the mansion's myth, bridging history and legend. The city itself seems to remember. Locals speak of the house in whispers, guiding outsiders around it after dark, as though acknowledging that some stories are not meant to be fully told, but cannot be ignored. And now I have to ask you, if you were walking past the LaLaurie Mansion alone at midnight, would you dare to glance up at the windows? Or would you keep your eyes fixed on the ground? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's see who among you is brave enough to face the shadows. The LaLaurie Mansion still stands on Royal Street, its white walls weathered, its wrought iron balconies darkened by time and memory. To the casual passerby, it may seem like just another elegant Creole home. But anyone who knows the stories, or feels the weight of history pressing from behind those shutters, knows it is anything but ordinary. Modern owners have attempted to renovate and restore the property, yet they cannot erase the mansion's past. Visitors sometimes report doors that creak open without wind, lights flickering for no reason, and the occasional whisper in a silent room. Paranormal investigators claim recordings of low moans, unexplained temperature drops, and shadowy figures moving against the grain of reality. Even in the daylight, the mansion casts a long psychological shadow. For centuries, New Orleans has grappled with what happened inside those walls, not just the fire, the cruelty, or Delphine LaLaurie's flight, but the legacy of fear, secrecy, and silence that continues to ripple through the city. Tourists and locals alike are drawn to it, both repelled and fascinated. It is a reminder that history is never just past. It lingers, haunts, and shapes our present. The mansion is a crossroads of myth and memory, cruelty and legend. Its stories have been amplified, distorted, and retold, but the echoes of 1834 remain. The whispers, the shadows, the chained cries, they exist in the spaces where fact and imagination meet. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them today. So, as the night deepens and the city sleeps, here is your sleepless question, the one that has kept New Orleans up for nearly 2 centuries. If you ever had to spend a night there, would you keep the lights off or would you run? Think carefully. Because in the LaLaurie Mansion, history never sleeps.